If we're a little shoddy here, I was supposed to be running the slides, but my my computer was having issues, so Jeff's going to drive for me. But I think we'll be pretty fluid here. As Flo said, we're coming over from SafeGraph. My name is Fletcher, and I work on the CS team as a customer success manager. And more broadly, in terms of my background, I am a geographer and have been in the space really my whole career, academically and professionally. Quick tidbits on me beyond that. Used to actually work for Cardo and help put on SDSC years ago. So it's really nice to come back in full loop, and have spent quite a bit of time on the data side in the last couple of years. And before that, fooled around in the remote sensing niche and some other adjacent areas. I know Jeff has a somewhat similar background, though is far more skilled than me. So I'll let him do a quick intro, and then I'll kind of jump into my thesis.
For sure. Yeah, I'm happy to be here at this talk. My background is actually as an academic, so mostly worked in environmental science, did a lot of academic research along that front, made the switch into data science, and now in the burgeoning field of spatial data science, primarily working in advertising. And then now I help lead our mobility patterns data product at SafeGraph. So really kind of winding rope, but kind of perfectly fitted for the moment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind moving ahead, Jeff, I'll kind of jump to my hot take. So I've got 2 points. I've got 2 points and then an eventual hot take, and then 2 analogies for a total of 5 tidbits that I'll try to drive home today. In terms of a general outline, I'll kind of touch on the theoretical side of how we think about varying types of spatial data at SafeGraph, and how we would encourage folks in general, regardless of if they're working with us or not, to think about spatial data. And then Jeff will speak to how we specifically achieve or try to achieve the goals we have in mind from a technological perspective on our product engineering and CS teams. So you'll see this point, and it might, by the way, seem kind of happenstance that we followed Veriset, which is a mobility company, and then Jeff runs our mobility side for me to make the point I'll make in a moment. But I think it will all make sense towards the end. And the point here up on the screen would seem to run counter to focusing on mobility data, and that it's saying essentially, most people, the vast majority of their purchases are still happening in person. And that would understandably sound surprising if you live, for example, in suburban Los Angeles. And at this point, you could quite easily be getting everything from your groceries to tools for your garage to services delivered to your door with minimal effort through services like Amazon or an Instacart or something like that. It's important to remind yourself, and we had it just mentioned in the last talk from Veriset, that data quality is disparate outside of places like the United States, and frankly even is within developed economies like the US. And that's just categorically not the case in a country like in India, one of my favorite places to travel to, where you're just not going to find even basic POI information in some of the largest cities, let alone more rural areas. So it's helpful to kind of zoom out in terms of scale when we see a point like this up on the screen, and then later think, how does that inform the way that we think about the varying types of spatial data that we want to source as a CPG company, in this case, to answer some of our questions. If you could move ahead to the next one. So CPG brands, obviously only one of many industries that are reliant on spatial data. But the question I've got here, is it the right data? And I would say yes, in terms of what we offer. But I personally have a subjective view as to where the attention tends to be allocated. So for a bit of context as to what we do here at SafeGraph, we're a data-only company. Our CEO sometimes says, hopefully in 100 years, we're just a better data company. So we don't have a SaaS product. We don't provide services, beyond obviously support and everything that happens in respect to the data product. We focus exclusively on creating ideally the best-in-class spatial data around, and specifically we focus on points, mobility data, or device level pings, and then geometries. So we call those proprietarily, respectively, our core places or POI data set, patterns, which has a couple different varieties dependent on cadence and whether you roll it up into a CPG or something else. That's kind of a suite that Jeff will talk to in a moment. And then geometry, which is pretty straightforward, but those are going to be the AOIs or areas of interest, most often buildings associated with commercial activity, but perhaps a park or something that you want to understand how people are moving around as well. So my hot take here, or two hot takes, are: one, stop thinking about only mobility data, which might sound crazy because we sell it. I think understandably, but maybe inaccurately, it tends to take the largest share of the pie in terms of people's attention span when we're talking about location data. And I've seen that incrementally trending upward in blog posts or Medium articles or conferences and what have you. And I think it's understandable, because when you, just as a layperson or even as a spatial data scientist or a geographer like myself, are thinking about ways in which we can understand the physical world and how humans interact with it, understanding how people are moving around seems like the first place to start. It also seems like probably the most technologically advanced, and therefore let's go with the best thing out there. The problem with that is that if you're not measuring what that mobility data is moving in relation to, then it doesn't really mean anything. And to kind of give a nod to Copernicus, the Earth isn't moving if you're not aware of the sun in which it's moving in relation to. The same idea plays out in mobility data, but at the scale of thousands or tens of thousands or millions or even billions of pings, and an equal number or near equal number of locations. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The second point, which kind of comes off of that, is I would really like by the end of this talk to crush the idea, often which is just subconscious, but to nonetheless crush the idea of POIs and geometries being static. So they're actually extraordinarily dynamic. They're typically representing, at least in our data sets and specifically in the context of CPGs, businesses. And as we all know, small businesses and any kind of business, big or small, ultimately has an expiry date, whether it's a year from now or 500 years from now. There is no permanence there, but it can be easy to, in relation to mobility data, see a store or a park as being permanent. So we really want to emphasize, again, stop thinking about just mobility data and stop looking at POIs and geometries as static and only your mobility data as dynamic. If you want to go ahead and kick it to the next slide, Jeff. So how are folks within the CPG space thinking about our data or spatial data in general? Well, I'll use kind of an elementary example, and I tend to do this often because I used to be a third grade teacher many lives ago. So forgive me for the third grade synopsis, but if I'm Fletcher's megalomaniac coffee company and I want to have coffee everywhere, you can tell I'm shooting from the hip here, Jeff. It's not on the talk track, but Fletcher's incredible coffee company. I want to know a couple of things, and you'll see them up here on the slide, but I want to know, where are we selling our products? And by extension, I want to know where we're not selling them. So already you're faced with a question that seems very intuitive, but is actually pretty hard to pin down at scale. So for example, if I have 10,000 stores, I probably have first-party data about how we're doing in those stores. But if those stores are distributed across multiple geographies with disparate quality of POIs, it might actually be tremendously difficult to identify what other stores adjacent to those stores could potentially be carrying Fletcher's amazing coffee. And that's where the quality and update cadence of those POIs becomes really important. Likewise, contextualizing that question with mobility data becomes important, because if the geometries aren't accurate, then we might be associating that ping to something that in fact isn't really relevant to the analysis. Likewise, kind of building off of that, what does CPG competition look like in a particular area? Well, TAM is probably the most common thing that I hear from CPG folks. And if you're not familiar with the acronym, it's total addressable market. So just saying, for example, I live here in Manhattan in New York City. If I'm selling some sort of protein bar, I want to first know before I make any other decision, how many stores could theoretically carry Fletcher's protein bars in all of New York City. So I want to know all the delis, all the Walgreens and Duane Reads, so on and so forth. Not an easy question to answer. And then finally, if I actually own my distribution and I'm not going through a wholesaler, which sometimes this isn't necessarily mutually exclusive, maybe I'm doing both, but in any case, if I have 500 Fletcher's protein bar stores, I hope there are never stores that only sell one type of protein bar, but if there were, I want to know where to put my next 10 stores and to make sure that I'm not cannibalizing my own stores, unnecessarily competing against Jeff's protein store, and ultimately making the best bang for my buck happen location for location, and continually revisiting that analysis, ideally quarterly, to make sure that I'm not bleeding out revenue in a way that I previously wasn't aware of. So these are common questions that we see in the CPG space within which we work pretty often.
Yeah, and thanks, Richard. That's, yeah, hey. I think that's great segue into how we answer a lot of these questions with the SafeGraph data. As Fletcher mentioned, we are not focused on having a analytics dashboard. We can spend 100% of our time on improving the data that we provide, and providing it in a cadence that really represents the dynamic nature of maps. And with respect to POIs, that we've seen that really useful and sort of borne out in the pandemic, right? So if you have a map of POIs of stores that sell Fletcher's protein bars potentially, from January 2020, the landscape now looks completely different from that. And so we strive to provide those dynamic representations of how the world looks sort of at a monthly cadence, representing the best and the brightest of all that we know. And usually when people think of POIs, people also think of expansion in terms of rows. So let's say not only do you want to know all the places that could sell protein bars, but you might want to know about industrial warehouses. You might want to know about last mile distribution centers. So of course, at SafeGraph, we're actively trying to add more rows to our data set, so more POIs. But I want to focus here on actually an approach that we've been doing to add more columns to our data set. In particular here, there are open and closed columns. So you'll see in this GIF or GIF, different columns that we've added that represent when we think that a particular store or POI opened, and importantly for the pandemic, which ones have closed. So that's something that we actively track through our ingestion pipeline. A quick note about that. Obviously, as we ingest sort of many different sources for our POIs, we have different data science algorithms on those different sources in order to maintain the highest quality data possible. So we have an algorithm for deduping different, you might get the same POI from different sources. We have an algorithm for assigning the right category, you see here category tags on the different POI. So these are different elements of the data science process that help to inform basically our maps of the real world. And since we provided it at that sort of monthly cadence, and we have a lot of faith in our definitive definitions of POIs, we can do interesting things here, like look at, there's a new source there's a new POI consistently appearing in all our sources, in downtown Manhattan. Okay, that's probably a new business that opened during this time. Similarly, if we're seeing a POI consistently disappear from our sources, then we have a fairly high confidence that this place is probably closed. And so that's a little bit about how we get to tracking open and closed. And this is similar to the mobility data that Fletcher is saying that we should look away from. And we think this way of tracking open close really gets at interesting questions at the CPG space. So you might want to know which new stores have opened up where I could be selling my products, right? Maybe you could get in on a sort of new market or new area because you're more dynamic than your competitors. for the pandemic, you might want to know which areas, which neighborhoods are recovering the fastest in terms of store reopening. So like places that have closed and sort of opened up, sort of reopened up. So like, how does that changing? In terms of site selection, you might want to sort of prioritize areas, markets in which your CPG product can get out in front of more people. And then that's really how we've seen customers get a lot of value out of POI data and the dynamic nature of it more broadly.
Absolutely. So kind of building off of this, and some of this will be redundant to what I was saying earlier, but we care not just about the mobility data, not just about the points of interest that we call our core places product, but we also care about attributing that to a geometry. And I won't go too deep on the technical side, but I'll actually kind of make one of my cheesy analogies here as to how we think about all three together in our product roadmap and also how we're servicing our customers. I'm a big F1 fan, and particularly a Ferrari fan for any of the Europeans in the call. But I would say that at SafeGraph, we really are hoping to be a Toyota versus a Ferrari. So if you know anything about cars, and I don't know why I'm talking about cars because I live in Manhattan and I'll probably never own one again. Toyotas are famous for being the least likely car to depreciate. You can buy one that's 10 years old and it will largely have retained its value. And that's because by and large, all of the boring stuff that goes into a car in terms of ensuring its durability and its utility is taken very seriously at Toyota's manufacturing plants. And they've long been known to car buffs for that. Whereas a Ferrari is world famous for being this very glamorous and extraordinarily fast and shiny product that has a very specific need that it solves for, which is looking really cool and moving really fast. I would say, try to be a Toyota in that, the mobility side is often the Ferrari, and we certainly have Ferraris in stock here if you want to buy one at SafeGraph. But by really pinning down, to Jeff's point, the dynamism of POIs, and we do that by having a monthly minimum update cadence for our POIs, sometimes faster, and similarly an even faster cadence depending on which patterns product you have, up to as fast as weekly. We're making sure that all three of the areas that we cover are given equal attention. And I think that was one of the things that really got me excited about working here, is that going to the basics and the fundamentals and thinking not how can we change how they're done, but just do them a little bit better and more thoroughly, levels up to understanding our building footprints attribution to a mobility data ping, for example. So one thing we do, and I'm kind of just spitballing here, but we are pretty good about identifying child polygons within greater parent polygons when possible. So back to my reference of Los Angeles, you can think of, say a contained Starbucks within a greater strip mall and understanding where that lives. It's also fairly legible in the data. You could also think about what to do, and this is something that we encounter that you just don't hear about outside of the data space often if you're a lay user of it, what to do when you don't have a geometry. Do you assign one synthetically, or do you decide to not put one at all there? And there's no black or white answer, but when we do create a synthetic polygon, which I can proudly say is a very small percentage of the data, we're not just arbitrarily guessing square footage, but we're looking across the totality of the real data we have to train the model to then say, okay, in this part of the world with this particular NAICS code of business types, this is an expected square footage. Let's go ahead and at least look at that first before creating a synthetic polygon against which we can intersect mobility data passing by that particular presumed location. Doing those things really well rolls up into the fancier Ferrari stuff that tends to make their way into a medium post. And to kind of drive the thesis home that I've said countless times now at this point, really taking POI data seriously and really taking geometry seriously, or AOIs seriously, is the change that I personally as a geographer would like to see become more commonplace in the spatial data provision within our industry. And I think that's happening. But, when you have lay users, and I'm even guilty of this myself, who open their phone to a Google Maps and just take that point as true, that somehow seeps into the same more analytical data we do in the workplace when we're faced with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of points, and we just take them to be true. So I would say come in wary of the accuracy, particularly pay attention to the cadence and to the quality of the geometries, and then and only then think about, okay, how can my mobility data and the relationality of it to those two other segments of the spatial data really answer the question I have? Should we hit the next one?
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. So Fletcher mentioned accuracy in our talk. In his accuracy is really sort of part of the ethos of what we try to do with SafeGraph. Like, it's why we focus primarily on data and providing data alone, not on sort of visualizations or sort of some sort of way to some analytics platform or something like that. And that focus, sort of maniacal focus on accuracy, really reflects in our polygon and geometry data set. So we understand that our users who want to use these geometries for things like visits attribution or for location-based marketing need actionable and very specific polygons to do this. And so Fletcher mentioned a few ways in which we do this. One thing we do is we track many features of polygons that are known to have downstream impacts on subsequent use cases. So as Fletcher mentioned, we track shared versus owned polygons, basically whether we believe the POI, like they are the ones who completely occupy this building footprint. We also track a field called enclosed, which is, for example, in an indoor mall, if you're going to a food court, Starbucks, for example, that's going to be a lot harder in the downstream when you're trying to attribute GPS pings there. So we basically surface this information because it's an artifact of our process. So we want to be as transparent as possible about uncertainties in the data. And as Fletcher mentioned, one of those, for example, is the number of, so we can't get building footprints for all the polygons that we have. So we report when that particular polygon is synthetic, by which we mean a lat long with a radius, versus an actual building footprint that we've been able to test and put through our QA process. It's actually one of our main things that we track in each monthly release, and we're always trying to get it down and improve that that estimate of, so that proportion of polygons within our data set. So really just talking to you about how that focus on accuracy reflects in the types of data that we provide and our process here, because it really matters. In this particular example, if you don't have the right polygon, you're potentially attributing that person's path to the wrong POI, and that's the whole ball game for us.
I think we could quickly power through this one and then get to the next one that I think is also on your side, Jeff. But I would just look at this slide. Feel free to even screenshot it if you work in the CPG space. It's just a great cheat sheet of common questions that I think are thoughtful questions to ask when you're trying to answer for some gaps, I guess you could say, in your understanding of the markets you serve or don't yet serve. Time and space are really the two factors to think about here. Time in particular as it relates to CPG, because obviously people aren't buying unilaterally throughout a given day. I will, for the sake of time, move forward to the next one with Jeff so that we have a little bit of time for a question. And if we don't, all good.
For sure, yeah. Thankfully, Verisit, going before us, did talk a lot about, so Verisit's our sister company, and our visits algorithm is similar, although we aggregate the visits product into POI-specific patterns. Yeah, so we leverage the same types of things: density-based clustering, learn-to-rank model, to attribute visits from a ping to or cluster to a different POI, and that makes it into our patterns product. Happy to talk more.
Yeah, so here, this is kind of just a rap sheet on what we focus on. I think I covered all of this. The only thing that I'll touch on is the difference between the two patterns products at the end. So we have different cadences that are available, and then we also have different roll-ups, which isn't the official word by any means, but our neighborhoods patterns project rolls up into the CPG. So if you maybe are looking at an area that you're not familiar with, or you don't have a particular POI in mind, or series of POIs or type of POIs that you want to look at in relation to when it comes to the mobility data and intersecting it, you could just say, okay, in general, what's happening in the census block group, and then kind of work backwards from there. So that's often popular, particularly with our CPG folks. Ways to get our data. So Carto is a great place to get our data. And like I said in the beginning of the call, we don't have a platform for visualizing or analyzing via a GUI our data. So if that's something that is more common in the types of workflows that you see at your company, or is a better place for you to get started, then that would be one place to get our data. And they've got a whole catalog with all sorts of stuff in there. So if you have questions beyond just what we have that you'd like to answer, you could take a look there. Obviously, you could reach out to us directly, and then we ourselves have a shop that has access to little samples of our data. So we are big on the try before you buy. So if you want to buy a very small AOI's worth of data for an area that you're already familiar with, to kind of use as a proxy for whether it makes sense at scale, that's an easy way to do it. And like I said, you can obviously, of course, reach out to us directly, and we can answer any questions from there. And I think that's it from our side.
Thank you very much, Fletcher and Jeff. I do have one quick question about industrial POIs. So warehouses, distribution centers, obviously logistics is a really high growth vertical with the booms of e-commerce out there. Is that something included in SafeGraph's data?
Jeff, do you want it, or do you want me to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'll for sure. Yeah, so that's industrial POIs is something that we've been adding to. I kind of alluded to earlier. It's like these are new rows in which we're adding to our POIs data set. And so, yes, we do include them, and we're continuing to expand in that area.
Fantastic. On the mobility data side of things, we've had a few questions about how the data is sourced. I know you touched on that in your presentation, but perhaps you could just explain a little bit more.
For sure, yeah. So if you heard the Veriset source, we largely use similar sources, but primarily the source of our mobility data come from mobile apps that people have, which represent, we do a lot of analysis on sort of coverage across the places in which we provide patterns, US and Canada. And so the sources are mobile devices and apps from apps that collect data there. I would watch the Veriset data. They explain that much better than me.
Cool. And then we have a question from Logan Lugo, who asks, considering physical, walkable, drivable areas of influence, how can network analysis, nodes and edges be used to evaluate non-physical... Oh, that's just moved on my screen. One sec. Okay. It's just disappeared from my screen, so we'll have to skip that question. Anyway, we are out of time. Sorry, Hopin's playing tricks on me here. Thank you, Jeff and Fletcher, so much for joining us. If anybody has any more questions for the SafeGraph team, please feel free to ask them on the chat. I'm sure that Jeff and Fletcher will be happy to have a chat with you there. And yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.